Here is a world of communication, bringing together all people in a new era of understanding.
Elektrischer Reporter.
Piepen, zwitschern, chilpen, liebe Zuschauer daheim an den Empfangsgeräten oder von wo auch immer Sie uns gerade zusehen. Piepen, zwitschern, chilpen. Diese drei Vokabeln bietet mein Wörterbuch mir an, als Übersetzung für das englische Verb to Twitter. Sollte der Erfolg der sogenannten Microblogging-Plattform Twitter weiter anhalten, müssten Wörterbuch-Herausgeber wohl bald noch eine weitere Translation hinzufügen, vielleicht eine kurze Nachricht über multiple Kommunikationswege einer variablen Anzahl von Empfängern zugänglich machen. Oder so ähnlich. Twitter ist the service everybody loves to hate, schrieb Clive Thompson vor ein paar Wochen in der Zeitschrift Wired. Ob Sie, liebe Zuschauer, Twitter lieben oder hassen oder aber mit einem Sack Reis assoziieren, ist natürlich ganz allein Ihre Sache. Als kleine Entscheidungshilfe kann ich Ihnen lediglich ein Gespräch mit Biz Stone anbieten, einem der Gründer von Twitter.
Twitter is a very simple service that asks people one question, and the question is, what are you doing? And they answer the question in 140 characters or less, because we route the question back out to people who are following your updates on SMS, also instant message, and also on the web. And we create that constraint so that it works universally, no matter what sort of device you prefer to use. And in addition to being a simple service, it's also kind of a platform that other people are now building on top of. We were very surprised by the amount of activity that went on in the API. Very early on, we thought it would be a good idea to open up some of our infrastructure just and let people play with it. But we had no idea that in under a year there would be more than 300 different applications being built on top of it. So everywhere from simple timers like call mom 15 minutes, and then in 15 minutes you get a message back that says call mom, or whole services created on top of Twitter, such as twittervision.com, which is a map of the entire world with real-time updates popping up all over it. It's very compelling to look at. It makes the world seem so small. Well, basically, my friend Jack Dorsey and I were working together at a different web startup company in San Francisco, and Jack had this idea that was sort of in the back of his head. He'd had it for a little while, and he thought, and he told me about it, and he said, I love LiveJournal, and I love blogging, and I love that I can share my life with my friends, but I wish there was an easier way to do it, maybe simpler, maybe more like the status field in an instant message application. And it was at that same time that me and some of my colleagues at work had been thinking, what kind of interesting ways can we tie mobile texting or SMS to the web so that we can create some kind of new services? And Jack's idea seemed like the perfect place to start. So we actually just took a little time, 2 weeks, and we went off with actually another developer named Florian Weber, who is originally from Berlin. And with his help as a contractor, we built a prototype of Twitter in about 2 weeks. Just enough to show it to the rest of the team and say, what do you guys think of this? Use it over the weekend and tell us what you think. And everyone was as excited about it as we were, so we ended up deciding that we should keep working on it. We had worked on it for a few months, and we had just enough people using it that it was beginning to get a little bit of steam behind it, and people were enjoying it, a limited amount of people, but just the right kind of people, because they turned out to be sort of tech-savvy people who are interested in experimenting with new things, and this idea of being able to send a text message that goes to a website that gets routed out to their friends, that was very interesting to them. And we went to a conference in Texas, which is a conference for interactive film and music professionals, and Twitter is it's nice to keep in touch with your friends and family on a regular day-to-day basis, but when you're at an event where everything is sort of compressed and you really want to know, what is everyone doing right now, where are we going tonight, where are we going to go for a drink, or where's the next party, it got a lot of use at that conference, and it sort of, from there, and while we were there we won an award for South by Southwest, and so just from there it continued to grow, and we got a lot of buzz, a lot of word of mouth buzz. We actually don't release the total number of users or updates. That's something that we keep to ourselves. But some interesting sort of just factual information is that back to the API, there's about 20 times more traffic on our API than there is on our website. So it further sort of diminishes the importance of the web. how it's more important that we have an open infrastructure and that we work over SMS and IM and these other ways that people can connect besides just logging onto a computer. So tying them all together and being agnostic about the devices that we use has been really important to us. So no, that's 20 times more traffic. And then another thing that I find interesting is that 90% of the people who use Twitter choose to keep their updates public, and only 10% mark them private for their friends, which I just think speaks to a general willingness for people to communicate out in the open more and more these days. Initially, we weren't sure. You know, when we created Twitter, we know we loved it, and we know the first weekend that we tried it out, we were actually giggling because we couldn't believe that we were getting our real-time updates, and they were so fun to get. But we weren't sure that everyone was going to like it, especially around the world. Maybe it was just a thing in San Francisco that people like to do. So when we started to see different companies popping up all around the world, in Germany and everywhere else, that were emulating the user experience, that's when we knew, well, this is definitely a marketable, real product that we should continue to work on. So rather than being discouraged, we were actually encouraged to put even more effort into it and say, this is great, let's keep working on it. Well, we have a few business models in mind. Some of them are obvious, and others are more interesting. But the thing is, the business models don't mean a whole heck of a lot until we have a very compelling service. So we're a small team. So right now, the business models that we have in mind they're kicking along and they're working, but they're sort of in the wings while we focus on user experience and growing the network. Because once we have a really compelling product, it'll make a lot more sense to then introduce the monetization aspect. For now, we're actually spending more money than we're making because we're not actively engaging and actually deploying the business model. To me, it sounds like it's the same old thing. You know, I can imagine back when they invented the telegraph that people were saying, if it's worth sending on a horse. What is this sending information back and forth? Trivial. But meanwhile, it's connecting the world together, and it's a very important information source. So it doesn't matter what the content of an individual message is. Yes, it may be very trivial and silly. In fact, the word Twitter means short bursts of trivial information. But I think that what's important is that people are connecting and they're sending emotional messages back to one another that mean something to them. And so, sure, you can look at the public timeline, you can look at a stranger's message about what they had for lunch, and of course you can feel that that's trivial. But when you look at what's going on underneath and you realize that there's a lot of people using it to communicate and coordinate and do interesting things, there's activism going on, there's people in Egypt who are using it to go against the government, to bring about change.
So there's this man right here, his name is Allah, and he's an Egyptian activist, and he has been in several sort of sketchy situations where he's been detained for questioning for untold periods of time, and he started using Twitter to keep his followers updated, other activists, where his whereabouts are. He's talking to the police, where he's headed, what's going on with the certain campaigns that they're working on, and in this way all his followers are constantly being updated. Okay, he's okay, so they know if he stops twittering, something's gone wrong, or if he needs to Twitter like I've just been picked up, I'm in jail, his followers can instantly launch into kind of a free Allah kind of campaign like they've done in the past to get him back out of jail. And the interesting story that Ethan told us was that there was this one situation where one of Allah's friends is named Abdel Monem, and he's a leading activist for the opposition party in Egypt, and and Allah got wind that his friend was about to be picked up, very quietly, just outside of his home. There was plans to go snatch him basically and take him, detain him for questioning. So Allah sent out a Twitter, and Allah has 120 or so followers, and in an instant all these followers went to Abdel's house and were immediately surrounded him and made a very public spectacle of this. So they were all sort of just surrounding him, and when the authorities came by to try to pick him up, it was all this whole big deal, and they just kind of passed on it. So the whole situation was diffused, and sort of the idea being that because of the immediacy of Twitter and the fact that it's mobile, this guy, was able to get out of this situation. So there's a lot of like really sort of much more important use cases for a very simple tool, it turns out, than we had ever expected, which is why we continue to work on it.
Sure, one message is trivial, but to that I just say, look at it in the aggregate and take a larger view of the technology, and then maybe try it out yourself before you look at the public timeline and dismiss it. Why do people buy fancy cars? Why do they dress up? Why do they wear these? Are they exhibitionists, or is it just the way that we function as people? We communicate in more ways than just mailing letters back and forth. We communicate by body language, by clothes, by what we choose to drive and what we choose to do. And more I think, using the internet and other technologies, people are communicating to one another, but they're keeping the communication open so that people in the periphery, or other people, can understand and hear what they're saying as a way of self-expression. So you can look at it as exhibitionism, but you can also look at it as social behavior, where you're inviting strangers into your conversation so that you can make a friend, so that you can make a business contact. For me, using blogging all these years has turned into a career. I mean, I was invited to write books about social media, and that's a dramatic example of just putting your thoughts on the web and having someone invite you to write a book. On Twitter, very simple things happen, like you Twitter that you've just arrived in Amsterdam, and suddenly someone contacts you and say, I live in Amsterdam, would you mind if I took you out for a beer and showed you around? So that's creating a social value out of a seemingly trivial message. And I think there's kind of like a social alchemy that takes place. You have all this allegedly meaningless stuff, but from it comes value. I think it's just this idea that by remaining open and letting all this stuff that's on the web and now coursing through instant message and IM and text messaging and everything, that it's all melting together in an interesting way, and there's a lot of value coming out of it. I mean, even if you just look at Twitter, like we did a few weeks ago, we took 1 hour of one day and we extracted just the verbs from that day, so we could see what are people watching, eating, listening to, looking at, and so from 1 hour we can get a slice of a certain section of the world. What are people watching? What are their favorite TV shows? And I think that all this open data on the web is creating a new source for finding out about ourselves and for meeting other people and just learning more about ourselves. So I think the open factor of everything is going to be a huge, and you see that reflected as well in companies. You see big companies more and more interested in being open and having APIs and allowing their services to create more surface area so that more people can extract more value on their own terms.
An dieser Stelle schlage ich übrigens offiziell den Begriff soziale Alchemie zum Wort des Jahres 2007 vor, während wir uns einmal mehr fragen, was ist eigentlich Web 2.0?
Web 2.0 ist, wenn du dir eigens einen Yahoo-Account zulegst, um Flickr zu boykottieren.
Und das, liebe Zuschauer, war es auch schon wieder für heute. Ich verabschiede mich und wünsche Ihnen eine inspirierte Woche. Bleiben Sie uns gewogen und schalten Sie auch das nächste Mal wieder ein. Bis dahin bleibe ich Ihr elektrischer Reporter.
Alles, was wir wissen und sind, stellt einen Ort in einem mehrdimensionalen Raum dar, der von Wert für die Art ist. Jedes Individuum zielt aus einer bestimmten Lebenssituation auf ein bestimmtes Tupel in diesem Raum. Jedes Individuum nimmt gleichzeitig auch eine aus vielen Tupeln bestehende Untermenge in diesem Wissensraum ein. Die Gesamtmenge der Tupel stellt seinen wissensgesellschaftlichen Wert dar. Dieser kann stagnieren, zunehmen, aber nie abnehmen.